Okay, ESA Part 2. I ended with critical habitat last time. So you can go onto the website and see what the Fish and Wildlife Service says about critical habitat. They have websites that not only report critical habitat but explain what critical habitat is. They even have a critical habitat mapper, and you can map different kinds of taxa. You can zoom in, and oh my God, you see critical habitat all over the place in California. Oh, you zoom into our neighborhood, and even there you see lots and lots of critical habitat. And so you see the Central Valley and the Delta being critical habitat for a number of species like the giant garter snake and the Delta smelt and a number of plants. And so you think, well, this is going to really impinge upon private landowners and reduce property costs. Actually, it's property values. It's actually a mixed bag that some people feel that critical habitat actually raises property values. But the point being is that critical habitat is a designation of area that they'd like to protect. It doesn't mean that because you have habitat in there that you can't get a take permit and change the habitat type. There are also recovery plans. Simple rationale: if we plan on recovering an endangered species, then we need to have a plan, and that we ought to say what criteria would fulfill our expectations of recovery. A critique of them is that they're non-binding and they're subject to political whims. The reality is that over the last decade or so, the agencies have moved towards having these to be collaboratively written with stakeholders to express the stakeholder views in those recovery plans. But the agencies have been catching up. There's supposed to update them every 5 years. They're woefully behind in that, so there are some that are actually they're taking offline because they've become so old and out of date that they're not very they don't have much credibility. So they're an example of a recovery plan. Here's one from more than a decade ago, but it's for a suite of 6 species in California, 2 endangered, 4 threatened species. The state's objectives: recovery goal is to stabilize, protect, and restore all populations in current locations, and this will allow for reclassification of species. And then it goes on to have recovery criteria about the number of populations and something to do with stability of those populations. And this relates to our conversation from Tuesday on thinking about population viability assessment and what actually constitutes adequate information to delist the species or reduce its listing based on its a mathematical assessment of its capacity to persist through time, or a viability assessment. Section 7 of the Endangered Species Act requires federal participation, and so this requires agencies to cooperate, and that it gives the Fish and Wildlife Service and NMFS the authority to rule on whether an action causes jeopardy. And so this also is important in terms of thinking about private property, that there are many private property actions, if they require government-backed loans or Corps of Engineers permits, things like this, that those government banks and the Corps of Engineers also have to participate in the Endangered Species Act. And so a private landowner may still run into Section 7 trouble if they're having a federal partnership or action involved. Section 7 also authorizes the GOD committee consisting of agency heads that can obviate the Endangered Species Act in the case of a national interest. A complaint with the Section 7 is that both by the Fish and Wildlife Service agency and by private landowners from the agency, the workers are saying they don't have sufficient time to study the problems, and there's political pressure exerted from above, and so they don't have the opportunity to make good decisions. On the other side, it's been criticized for stifling development. However, environmental groups often actually criticize it for just the opposite reason. World Wildlife Fund evaluated Section 7 outcomes in one particular district of 100,000 consultations over a 7 or 8 year period. The project stopped 54. Now That suggests that it's not the beast that business makes it out to be, but hard to know whether this is an accurate view, since what things weren't proposed because they were endangered species, or what plans were modified as a consequence of Section 7 but went forward anyway, and were much better as a consequence. That's a very difficult thing to get a handle on. Okay, so Sections 9, 10, and 11. Section 9 prohibits any person from taking or engaging in commerce in endangered species. So in other words, you can't go out and shoot bald eagles or things like that. I guess it's another law that prevents that, but you can't harvest endangered species. And Section 10 allows agencies to grant permits for exemptions from Section 9. In other words, private citizens can get take permits, and so as to develop on private property, and these actions must not significantly raise the extinction rates risk for species, and so it might mean that if you're going to destroy some habitat, you're going to participate in the protection of some other habitat, and this is the stimulus for habitat conservation planning. Section 11 stipulates penalties, and that's about the end of the legislation. Okay. So ESA in action: plants on private property are not specifically protected. So this again reiterates this thing that plants are owned by the private landowner, and as a consequence you don't need a permit to take them, which means that the ESA has considerably lower protection on private property. But again, if there's a federal action like a wetland filling permit, then it still needs to be considered. So let's go talk about a few case studies. This is Torreya taxifolia, a federally listed endangered tree in North Florida. This is its distribution. It's just that little dot up around the Florida, Alabama, Georgia border. It's about 35 miles long, 10, 12 miles wide on these ravines, gray shaded areas. The black area that you can't see in that map is a town. But it's mostly in these ravines on that east side of the Apalachicola River. There's a couple hundred individuals, no mature adults. The range is very small. There was a catastrophic decline due to disease in the early 1960s. There's a recovery plan. It's very, very old. There's been almost no Fish and Wildlife Service actions up to about 2005 or 6. There was also no spending on the species at all. Since then, that spending has gone up a little bit to do some disease studies to look at what that disease might be. No critical habitat, no safe harbor, no HCPs, no recovery plan revisions, and as I mentioned, until last 5 or 6 years, no expenditures to speak of. And so this is a kind of a common thing of putting something on the list, but then not really doing very much about it. As a consequence, other people have, and so here are the Torreya Guardians, who are planting this tree in North Carolina about 5 years ago. It's one of these assisted migration stories. We'll talk about this later in the quarter. Another one, Curtis's pearly mussel. Over the last couple of years, lots of clams and snails have been moved onto the list. If you look at the NatureServe's estimate of threat, they suggest that there are an awful lot of aquatic species that are in deep, deep, deep trouble. But here, this one is something that was categorized as an imperiled species in 1968, but not put on the list until 1987. By then, it was already extinct. And so this is the Center for Biological Diversity saying that a lot of our listing action has just been after the deed is done. And so this is data from the Center for Biological Diversity. These are 18 species that were listed after they went extinct. This was a few years ago. These new listings in the last couple of years under the Obama administration may add to that list. These things went extinct without listing. And then these things went extinct shortly after being listed. So their argument is that we're listing things way, way too late. By the time we list them, they're effectively done, and there's not much we can do about them. Anyway, that's a couple of kinds of things that are a little bit bleak in terms of what listing actually does for endangered species. I'm going to try pausing it right here and start up again with to show a couple of other slides associated with that. So a variety of people have suggested that the endangered species list is where species go to die, that there are lots of things waiting for listing, and that they aren't doing very well. I'm going to talk a bit about that for the next few slides. So in 2005, Tim Mayle and Michael Bean, every 2 years the agency puts out a report to Congress saying what fraction of species are stable, declining, or improving. To be honest, that an awful lot of the species get classified as unknown in 2005 based on the 2002 reports. This was where we stood. This is where we stand now with the 2010. With a lot of species still declining. These folks go on to say that money helps, that birds, mammals, and fish over on the left get the most expenditures per year, and that the line represents the proportion that are declining, and fewer of those are declining than plants, reptiles, invertebrates, and amphibians. It's not a simple story, but this may certainly help. Species in aquatic environments are much more likely to be declining than in terrestrial environments. They also argue that funding gets results, that these are the overall status trend across time, from repeated declines to repeated improvements from left to right, and the mean funding is in the vertical bars, and so those things that are improving tend to have funding for them. And you can see that funding is very, very skewed. I'll have a little bit better way of saying this in just a moment, but the last thing that Mayle and Bean suggested was that it's very difficult to see how expenditures get done. That if you look at expenditures by the threat category by the Fish and Wildlife Service, these dots represent species from the high to the low threat category, and across the y-axis, x-axis, the amount of spending, suggesting that what seems to drive spending is the recovery of funding, is congressional districts and politics rather than need. But here's the graph that I did a few years ago based on something like 2008 expenditures, where you ranked species from the ones we spend the least on the left to the ones we spend the most on the right, and then the cumulative amount of those expenditures. This is it's called a Gini coefficient, or a Lorenz curve. The coefficient's the number, the curve's the line, where if you have equal expenditures for all species, that would be that gray even allocation line. The degree to which something deviates from that is an expression of income inequality, so it's often used in economics. The green and the yellow line represent recovery plan costs and plant recovery plan costs, reflecting this idea that not all species are equally costly to recover. The dark blue line represents total expenditures. That's Fish and Wildlife Service, NIMS, Department of Defense, all the federal agencies, plus all the state wildlife agencies. And the orange dashed line represents Fish and Wildlife Service expenditures, and the dotted line, Fish and Wildlife Service plant expenditures. And so what it suggests is that we have way more disparate funding than would be suggested by the costs of recovery, and that this disparate funding is not just among the politically charged species, but also extends down to just the Fish and Wildlife Service agency expenditures on things that are least politically volatile, the plants. That there's still a way more unequal distribution of funds than you'd expect. This is that curve redone to represent the years 1998 to 2012. So a 15-year span, there's almost no variance in this, that it is in unequal expenditures across that entire span of time. Okay, so I'm going to end part number 2 right there and go on to part number 3.